Hey, this is Dan Lehman from AutomationHelpers.com. In today's video, we're going to talk about how we can use default values and also be able to override values inside a SmartSuite. Now, some of you might be wondering, well, Dan, don't we have the ability to already use default values? And yes, we do, but this scenario has come up so many times with my clients that I just want to share this information with you as well. So I'm going to give you a concrete example. Let's dig in right here. So I'm inside a SmartSuite, and the use case is that we have invoices, and these invoices have multiple contractors, and each contractor has an hourly rate that we want to be able to associate with this. Imagine it's $50 an hour times 10 hours equals $500. So that's kind of the scenario here, and we want to talk about how we can have both a default rate as well as a different rate that we might assign, or essentially an override rate. So to set this up, I'm on my invoices, and I've got this linked to my contact, Angela, and her hourly rate is $50. Now, many of you might start off by assigning this just a field here for that hourly rate. This is a currency field, and we'll talk about how we might change that in just a moment here. But imagine we've got our hourly rate, $50 an hour, we've got our 10 hours, and then we've got our total amount. And this total amount is a formula field. So I could go ahead and take a look, and this is just multiplying across our hourly rate times our number of hours. But in this case, Angela is working on a particularly complex project, and so we want to give her a higher rate for this. She's going to ask for $75 an hour instead of $50. So here I could go ahead and click, and I could change that value to 75, but we still want to be able to track what her default rate is, because on the next project, it might be $50 an hour for that. So this is where you might say, okay, well, Dan, we've got the ability in modify field settings to go to default and enter a default amount here. Now this works well when the data is pretty standardized, right? So if we worked with contractors and they all had the same base rate, this would make sense that we could use that default value. But the reality of the situation is so many times you've got different kinds of needs where it's not just a single default value that makes sense. If we work with a bunch of different contractors, they might be all over the place in terms of the rates that they're making. There might be someone who's making $50 and someone who's making $100 an hour. So let's go to our contacts here, and let's instead have an hourly rate, their default, their standard rate that's going to be on the contact record themselves. So Angela might be at 50, and Debbie's default rate is 75, and Diego is 65. And this gives us that ability to have configurable default rates for those individuals on that contact record. So if we come back over to invoices, how do we get that value over here? Well, this is what we can do with a lookup field. So I'll search for a field of lookup type, and we're going to call this the standard rate. And that's going to be that individual standard rate. And so we're going to pull it from the contact, and then we're going to look up their hourly rate field that we have. So hourly rate, go ahead and add that, and we can see that that pulls that over as $50. Now remember that this is locked, that if you actually want to edit that field, you do so on the contacts, but that's where we get that base rate. And then hourly rate now turns into more the override value. So in this case, we're going to use $75 an hour is what she's getting on this particular project. Now, just to make this a little bit more clear, let's go ahead and change this to call it override so that we're not confused by standard rate and hourly rate. This is going to be in this one-off scenario where we want to be $75 an hour. Now, over here for our total amount, okay, this is good because it now multiplies the new hourly rate across to $750. But what if we didn't actually want to override it and the amount was empty? Well, now that says 0. That's not what we want to calculate. We want to be able to either use the default standard rate or be able to charge the override hourly rate. We don't want this to be 0. So this is kind of at the crux of this conversation. How do we have default or override values? So let's go into our total amount here. And unfortunately, we won't be able to use just our simple editor. We need to go to our advanced editor. So this will change it a little bit. And now we're going to say, okay, if there's just that default rate and there's no override rate, then we're going to use that default. But anytime that override is present, always want to use that override. So how do we do that? Well, if we're doing any kind of logic like that, we need to have an if statement. So we're going to say if, and we're basically saying if that value is present, if that override is there. So we'll go ahead and click here and say we'll use that hourly rate. So if that hourly rate is present, then we want to use that hourly rate. Okay, that makes sense. And if it's not, we're going to use our standard rate. Now, if we start typing that, we don't actually see that field. Well, that's because that lookup itself isn't going to be available in our formula, but never fear, we can still access that data. So instead, we're going to use our linked contact relationship, and then we'll use that dot notation, and we can say our, what do we call it, hourly rate, and that's the amount that we will use instead. So let's see what this looks like so far. Let's update our field. And we can see that it now gives us that $75. Okay, so this override is present, therefore the total amount is $75. If we delete this out, let's see if that updates. Now it's $50. This is where we get that behavior. Now, if you wanted a field instead of total amount and just say actual rate or something like that, you could. But for some people, that's an eyesore. That's too many fields that they have on the screen here. So we know we have the logic working for us. Now all we need to do is change it so that we can multiply this by the number of hours. And if we update that, that's now going to give us our new total. So 10 hours at $75 an hour is $750. Or if we don't override that, then it updates to $500, or maybe we do $85 an hour. So essentially what we're doing is we've got the logic baked in to let us be able to have defaults and overrides. I hope this has been helpful for you to see how you can use default and override values in formulas. And of course, there's lots of different use cases outside of just invoicing. So I'd love to hear how you're going to use this in your own SmartSuite implementation. Now, if you have any questions on getting started with SmartSuite, don't hesitate to reach out for a free 30-minute consultation at automationhelpers.com.